Good afternoon. My name is Jim Townsend, and I am the director of the Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy here at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel discussion with the Levin Center's Oversight Fellows. The three scholars we will hear from today are the inaugural group of Oversight Fellows who have received support from the Levin Center to conduct research and write articles aimed at advancing our understanding of legislative oversight and related topics. This fellowship program was established last year to encourage scholars, especially those early in their careers, to conduct research and produce papers with results related to oversight by legislators and the role of legislative fact-finding in our democratic system. I'm going to say a word about the fellowship in general here. Each year, the fellowship offers between $10,000 and $20,000 to support one-year non-resident scholars to conduct research and produce a scholarly paper on issues related to congressional and state level oversight. To learn more about the Oversight Research Fellowship Program, please visit the Levin Center's website. That's levin-center.org. And you can click on the Oversight Scholars tab at the top navigation. I think we'll put a direct link to that page in the chat, so you can go there directly if you like. We are so pleased to have such an exceptional group of academics participating in this fellowship and here with us today to discuss their research into when, how, and why Congress conducts oversight. So with that, I want to introduce Jennifer Celine. She is the co-director of the Levin Center's Washington office, and she leads the center's research-related work. Jen, who is an academic in her own right and was most recently at the University of Missouri, will serve as the moderator of today's panel. So Jen, with that, please take it away.
Thanks, Jim. I'll give you a brief idea of how we decided to organize this webinar today. So we're going to organize it like a traditional academic conference in that we will hear a short presentation from each of the three fellows, and then I will follow up with a few remarks of my own, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. And so at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the question and answer part of the Zoom, and I will relay those to the panelists themselves. And with that, I will introduce our three fellows of this year. It's been really fun to watch their projects develop. Our first fellow is Devin Judge Lord, who is currently a postdoc at Harvard University. Second, we have Claire Levitt, who is an assistant professor at Grinnell College and recently just took a job, and she will be moving to Smith College in the fall. And then we have Kenny Lewendy, who is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan. And so we're going to go in alphabetical order, which means that first up is Devin.
Thank you so much, Jen. Let me share my screen here and make sure that that works. Able to see my slides? Excellent. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be able to present, and I just want to start by thanking the Levin Center for the support, and Jen and everybody for Elise Bean was really helpful in scoping all of this work. So it's been a pleasure to work on this with the support of the full team. Going first, I'm going to start with a very broad scope. In fact, I'm a little bit pushing the boundaries of what we might consider oversight. That's sort of part of what I want to argue and provoke. This project really started as looking at all of the relationships that members of Congress have with the federal bureaucracy, and then asking which types of those relationships might be interesting for oversight scholars to study. So you'll hear more from Kenny and Claire about traditional oversight hearings and things, and I'm going to talk about some other data and types of interactions that might be interesting for scholars. So just as an oversight, as I said, I started with this big question of how are all the ways in which members of Congress engage with federal agencies, especially, and the executive branch. And so one, we have coordinating drafting of legislation, right? Asking for information that turns out to be relevant for legislating. This is the core legislative function of Congress. And we might not consider this oversight, although a lot of oversight investigations might sort of inform how legislation is drafted. But there are a bunch of other things that Congress does. There's kind of the traditional, what we think of as oversight in conducting hearings, investigations, writing reports. And then there's other types of follow-up that, legislators do after the legislative process has resulted in an authority being delegated to the executive branch. The executive branch needs to make rules that implement those, develop guidance. They need to allocate budgets after appropriations have been made. So there's a lot of policy that gets made in the executive branch, and members of Congress are involved in that process as well. They oversee, they attend to policy being made in the executive branch. And then there's the implementation of those policies, and the ways in which members of Congress engage in this is what we can call it casework or constituency service, where somebody needs a check from the VA or from the Social Security Administration, and members of Congress help grease the wheels to make things happen that maybe should be happening, but there might be something wrong with the process. And I'll come back to this because I think there are interesting ways that this might alert members of Congress to oversight opportunities. And so I'm getting at this through a number of different large new data sets that I'll talk about. One involves correspondence between members of Congress and agencies that we got through Freedom of Information Act requests. So we asked all of the government agencies and the federal government for the incoming mail that they receive from Congress, including emails and phone calls, in order to track the full scope of how members of Congress were interacting with them. And then I also collected a massive amount of records from agency rulemaking in order to assess the extent to which members of Congress are engaging in agency rulemaking. And then also looking at the relationship between agency budget justifications and then appropriations subcommittee reports. So there's a lot of communication between agencies and members of Congress about how to spend money. And we might think of that as potentially relevant to oversight as well. I'm actually just going to focus on a few of these for the sake of time here. And specifically, I want to focus on these sort of post-legislative policymaking things that aren't maybe traditionally in the oversight wheelhouse, but I think have some really interesting connections. And I'm going to focus on the data that involve correspondence between members of Congress and agencies, including those that come from the rulemaking records. These are two data sets I'm putting together here. And I want to start by acknowledging that the Levin Center funds enabled me to hire 6 wonderful research assistants. So these are research assistants both from Harvard and from Wayne State Law School, who then read tons of documents. So there's a couple of documents. I'm going to show a bunch of documents. You don't have to try to attempt to read the tiny text on the screen. I'll tell you what's in them, but I want to give you a flavor for them. But I want to acknowledge that these research assistants did an amazing amount of work reading highly technical documents, communications between members of Congress and agencies, and pulled out some important information that we wanted to extract from these for the purposes of creating a database that allows us to study a lot of different things by cutting these data different ways. And so this is a hand coding exercise of documents that I collected and sort of pre-processed with some large scale text analysis. Now, my research is typically really like big picture. I tend to analyze thousands or millions of documents to draw broad conclusions about political science and congressional behavior. But before I get into the sort of quantitative conclusions, I want to give you a flavor for what the raw data look like. So as I said, I'm gonna put some documents on the screen. You don't need to read them. I'll tell you what they're about, but I want you to get a flavor for what these research assistants had to wade through in order to get the information that we're going to use in the analysis. So first of all, we have kind of these traditional oversight hearings that you'll hear more about in the next presentations. Hearings, investigations, both of governments and companies are what kind of come first to mind when we think about oversight. So through hearings like those that Senator Levin conducted around vulnerabilities in money laundering, legislators shine a spotlight on problems that demand government action, oftentimes action from federal agencies. So in kind of pushing the conceptual bounds of what we think of as oversight, I want to include some other types of attention to the executive branch especially those that are out of the spotlight, right? So the more routine and mundane things that congressional offices do that are related, but oftentimes don't get the same kind of media attention. They're not aired on C-SPAN. Oftentimes, nobody besides the legislator and the legislator's office and the agency personnel even know that these communications are going on. But the nice thing about them from a research perspective is that there's a lot of it, and it's fairly continuous. So we can track changes over time. We can assess changes across members of Congress, and we can identify broad-scale patterns, right? So in the quantitative portion, I'm going to show that congressional attention is really quantitatively focused on agency rulemaking. I think there's something important there. And these hearings and these investigations demand actions that are often then taken through agency rulemaking. So for example, this hearing and these investigations, actually between a series of these hearings on money laundering, Senator Levin was also communicating with the agency as they made rules about money laundering. And so here Senator Levin is writing to the agency to actually support their policymaking. And so I would argue that if questioning an agency head about what they're doing in a hearing is oversight, then submitting comments to the same agency about how they're following up from that hearing, the actions they're taking, that they might be called in for a hearing in the future, is definitely relevant to oversight research. Now, I find that members of Congress are more likely to criticize agency rules, actually more likely than interest groups to criticize agency rules. They're oftentimes kind of critical of what the agency is doing. There's lots of examples of legislators being positive and actually helping and supporting the record. So here, Senator Levin is writing in support of the rule and is citing the investigations and hearings as evidence for why this rule is important, right? Building up that record. Here in another example, similarly, Senator Levin here is writing to the IRS, entering into the record, the committee report and a full 1,000-page PDF hearing transcript, right? The entire transcript of the hearing. And this one actually almost broke my my text analysis methods, because not only is it 1,000 pages of PDF text, but it contained a lot of names of members of Congress. And my algorithm intends to extract the names of members of Congress and to identify the authors of these letters. But here is much more than the authors, right? Because it's everyone who participated in the hearing. I'm going to click through these pretty fast, right? Again, this is just to get a flavor for the kind of data. And as I said, it's not all positive, right? So in this letter, Senator Levin is chastising 5 different agencies for being too slow to finalize the VOCA rule, which limits high-risk trading coming out of the Dodd-Frank bill. And so here are some, these all kind of, you can see the connection to oversight hearings, but we might also look a little bit broader and think about other ways in which attention from members of Congress sort of shape the making of policy in the executive branch. And so one way is in statutory interpretation. Members of Congress have expertise because they draft bills, and they also have opinions because they are authors of legislation about how agencies should interpret those statutes. So here, Senator Levin is taking issue with the statutory interpretation the Small Business Administration used in making its policy. And agencies take this kind of information seriously. So here, we have the follow-up from the agency administrator, replying to Senator Levin and saying, "I'm taking a hard look at the things you raise, and possibly these things being incorporated into the policy," right? And in some of my quantitative research, I show that comments from members of Congress on agency rules are some of the most effective in terms of moving rules compared to different types of groups that submit comments to rulemaking. Another related way that members of Congress engage in agency rulemaking is how to use discretionary authority, right? So here the Dodd-Frank bill allocated discretionary authority to the Treasury. Senator Levin is writing, following up post-legislation on that discretionary authority and saying, "I know that you have discretionary authority, but here's how I would go about using it," and kind of being attentive to that process all the way through. And then another important aspect of this that I'm really interested in is that members of Congress don't do oversight alone. They're often engaged in oversight and policy work with interest groups, with constituencies, and those interactions, right? So here, Senator Levin is writing to say that I've been in contact with the agency about, this is the Department of Labor making safety regulations, but I know that a bunch of my constituents are also interested in these safety regulations, and I'm attaching a bunch of my constituents, in this case, a pretty well-organized group of dentists that had opinions about how OSHA was going to regulate safety in dental offices related to bloodborne diseases. These are very technical things, but in this case, the dentists are organized in an association. They are engaging their member of Congress. The member of Congress is engaging the agency. All of this to follow up and implement legislation. Okay, so that's a flavor of the data. Here's the big picture, and the Levin Center project that I did through my fellowship is really about combining these two data sets to see what they could tell us about oversight. So one data set is over 500,000 now legislator contacts with all federal agencies since 2007, and we would love funding to keep that data set growing over time. It's a fairly large initiative to continually file these FOIA requests to get all of these correspondence with members of Congress. But through 2020, we have them digitized and hand-coded by research assistants. And this data set allows us to compare legislators across legislators with each other, right? Because we know all of the behavior. It's not limited to some set of legislators, and it's not too limited to the agencies. It covers a pretty wide swath of the government. So we can compare across legislators, across agencies. The second data set allows a different set of comparisons. Here, where it's only about rulemaking comments, but we have them both for legislators and for other interest groups and other people. So now we can compare across legislators, interest groups, and assess the similarities and differences between how legislators are engaging and how other groups that might be raising fire alarms or doing similar types of work are engaging differently than legislators are. And so of the sort of 50 million comments, I've identified at least 5,000, really sort of 6,400 that are from legislators, and have digitized and coded about 10,000 total, about half of those from legislators. So some quantitative data. Most contacts with agencies are about constituency service and sort of the implementation of policy. So it's 81% of the constituency service, which we break out into, whether it's on behalf of a nonprofit or local government or a corporation or an individual. Most of it's on behalf of individuals. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus on this smaller portion, this 19% that relates to policy work. Now, when we break out policy work into, and I should say, again, this is what the research assistants are coding for in these letters. What are these letters about? What are members of Congress contacting about? And we see a small-ish category, but a substantial number of contacts are about traditional oversight. They're following up on hearings, inviting agency officials to hearings, drafting reports, seeking information, right? And then we have a slightly larger category that is that pre-legislation coordination, right? Where they're asking for information related to drafting legislation. But by far the biggest category here is this post-legislation oversight, engagement, attention. And again, most of that is comments on agency rules, but I also include in there follow-ups on appropriations bills. So how agencies should allocate money that Congress has allocated to the agency. And there's a smaller catch-all category there for related to lawsuits, disaster response, other things that members of Congress write about that are policy related. Now, further, we can break this out into who the member of Congress is sort of aligned with, right? And so I'll just do one cut here, which is it related to a business group and a corporate advocacy, which you can see a small slice of that light blue color in the post-legislation oversight related to rulemaking is kind of related to business advocacy. But the vast majority of it, nearly all of it in the traditional oversight category and the coordinating on legislation is really coordinated with public interest groups. I include groups like the Levin Center that enable members of Congress to do perhaps better oversight or inform them about what kind of oversight opportunities exist into this category of public interest groups, or it's driven by members. And there's still that yellow category there of letters that haven't finished coding. We can also break this out by party, right? So we can slice this a number of different ways. In this time period, Democrats did a little bit more or substantially more contacting, especially related to legislation. Now, again, this is the Obama and the Trump years, so disproportionately a Democrat president. There is a correlation there. It's a little bit hard to say why that exists, whether it's because there's a Democrat president, but that could be one explanation. We also see a lot of variation across agencies, right? I'm trying to just give you a tour here of the different ways we can slice these data. So while congressional attention focuses on rulemaking at most agencies, at Homeland Security, it's disproportionately sort of traditional oversight activities. It's a lot of hearings and reports that members of Congress are contacting Homeland Security about. And then Department of Agriculture, it's almost all about the Farm Bill, right? There's a lot of communication, and there's a lot of communication about drafting the Farm Bill. I'll just do two more sort of cuts of the data here. One is about the timing, right? So now focusing just on rulemaking comments, it's very uneven over time. It's punctuated, and one reason that is punctuated is that agencies make rules in not consistent number of rules over time. But this is also due to the fact that members of Congress often engage when a rulemaking process is raised in the profile, some interest groups call attention to the fact that a member of Congress might want to get involved and oversee what the agency is doing as they make policy. So it's much more punctuated and uneven than it would be if they were paying kind of equal attention to the various rules that agencies make. And then finally, we can do sort of statistical analysis to say, all right, well, putting all of these things into a model, what are the factors that matter a lot? And so when we look at the policy related contacts with federal agencies, being a committee chair really matters. So these are just predicted probabilities from a statistical model that shows the years of Congress there on the x-axis and the predicted number of letters that the average member of Congress is going to write to the federal agencies, and a member that doesn't become a committee chair in their 6th year writes significantly fewer policy-related letters than a member who becomes a committee chair and has access to committee staff. We can also do this analysis within legislature, right? We have large amount of data here, and we can assess the predicted change in the same legislator as a committee chair and is not a committee chair. What do we predict their behaviors like? And we see that chairs really seem to do a lot more, have the capacity to do a lot more policy work. And then, well, I'm already over time, so I'll skip the sort of full model results, but happy to talk a lot more about the sort of statistical regressions. And I'll leave it there and just thank everybody again. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Devin. I look forward to hearing more about the models in the Q&A as well. And so next up, we have Claire.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen here and hope that you can all see my slides. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the Levin Center for hosting us and hosting this webinar today. I'm really happy to be here presenting the project that I've been working on with the Levin Center's support over the past year. And my project very broadly explores the effect of partisanship on the quality of oversight in Congress. And my project was really primarily inspired by two big questions. The first is, how do committees decide what to investigate and oversee? How do they construct their oversight agendas? There are seemingly unlimited possible topics and investigative targets, both inside and outside the government. And committees in both chambers are pretty severely limited by time, money, as well as by their own legislative mandates, which reduces the amount of time that committees can devote to oversight. And the second big question that my project addresses is what is the effect of partisanship on these agendas? So there's been a lot of great recent scholarship on how the quality of oversight in Congress has been diminished and delegitimized by hyper-partisanship. And so I was really interested in perhaps shedding some light on the extent to which committee majorities build oversight agendas around this desire to position take on behalf of their party. And so I asked, whether or not committees prioritize certain types of oversight hearings over others due to the partisan incentive. And so to get at this question, I wanted to see if I could come up with a standard for oversight quality in Congress. So oversight on a set of issues for which there is a demonstrated prior need, because oversight on these issues would thus, be a lot less likely to be motivated solely by partisanship. So in essence, I want to measure how well Congress responds to bureaucratic problems that have been identified by independent observers as the most significant, the most important. And there's been a lot of great work done by scholars like David Mayhew and Sarah Binder and Josh Clinton, John Lipinski, and a lot of others on how well Congress is legislatively addressing salient policy issues. And so I'm kind of attempting to do the same thing for oversight, to set a standard for oversight and measure how well Congress actually lives up to that standard. And so to do this, I turn to the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. And GAO is a nominally independent and nonpartisan legislative agency. It's often referred to as the auditor of the American state. Its director is appointed by the president and congressionally sanctioned, but insulated from political retribution. And the credibility of the agency's work has been lauded by members on both sides of the partisan aisle. And every 2 years, GAO publishes a high-risk list. And this list is published at the beginning of each Congress, and it identifies the agencies, programs, and operations that are most vulnerable to waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement in the administrative state. And GAO published its first high-risk list in 1990. And at the time, they identified 14 unique high-risk areas. Since then, the list has climbed significantly and pretty steadily, up to 36 items in the most recent report published in 2021. And the crux of my argument in this project is that I argue that GAO meets the standard of high. The GAO consists of very highly informed, very well positioned, independent observers who would be able to set this credible normative standard for oversight quality, the issues that Congress should be examining most closely, the issues most in need of congressional attention. And this question of quality is a really pertinent one, I think, because of the consensus in the literature that extreme partisanship in Congress has politicized and thus delegitimized the process of oversight. And so there are lots of scholarship that has confirmed that committees convene more oversight under divided government, when the president and the congressional majority are of different parties, than under united government. And this is, members themselves have said the same thing. Just to give you a couple of examples, here we have Tom Davis, former chair of the House Oversight Committee, arguing that Congress no longer operates as an independent branch of government, the result being that the president's party tends to under-investigate and the opposition party over-investigates. We've also got, just for example, Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, saying, back in 2017 that Republicans, the Republican House Majority, under the Obama administration, politicized oversight, that they conducted gotcha oversight as opposed to substantive oversight. And this really gets at the assumption, this idea of gotcha oversight, gets at the assumption behind these findings that divided government produces more oversight. And that's that more oversight doesn't necessarily equal better oversight, right? Quantity does not necessarily equal quality. Under divided government, committees might convene hearings primarily to score political points against the opposition. And there's good reason to believe that they might do this. David Mayhew's work cites oversight hearings as public actions that promote position taking. Doug Kreiner and Eric Schickler's work shows that investigative hearings have the power to depress a president's public approval rating. And that makes oversight a very effective tool for harming the opposition party. And so the kind of normative fear inherent in all of this is that oversight motivated by partisan concerns would take precedence over fact-based, nonpartisan, substantive investigations dedicated to making government more efficient and more effective. And this is kind of the gold standard of oversight, if you will. It's a standard, obviously, the Levin Center promotes, but also a standard that members themselves on both sides of the aisle claim to uphold. And just again, to give you some examples, we have Darrell Issa, the former House Oversight Chair, stating that oversight should not be used as a political weapon, but should be devoted to identifying and ferreting out waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement in government. We have, Henry Waxman, also former House Oversight Chair, saying essentially the same thing. And it's worth mentioning that both of these chairs were, of course, denounced by their opposition at the time for their partisanship. But the broader point here is that members themselves recognize the standard for oversight quality, regardless of whether or not one thinks that they personally uphold it. And so what I try to do in this paper, again, is to establish an oversight agenda for Congress based on this gold standard. And I argue, this agenda is encompassed by GAO's high risk list. And then I test whether partisan incentives, and that's measured as divided government, affects the extent to which committees prioritize this high quality oversight. And I rely on two original data sets to do this. The first is a set of all non-legislative hearings held by all standing committees in the House and Senate from 1990, that's the first year the high risk list was published, to 2016. And this data comes from the Policy Agendas Project. And then I hand-coded, with the help of my wonderful research assistant, hand-coded each hearing according to whether it addressed an issue on GAO's high risk list for that particular Congress. And the second data set that I construct was built actually from GAO high risk list reports themselves, and consists of all discrete legislative provisions enacted per Congress that GAO itself identified as having meaningfully addressed an issue on that particular respective high risk list. And I argue that legislative solutions are relevant here for a few reasons. First, that legislation is often the culmination of fact-finding through oversight. And it can often be very hard to delimit where oversight ends and where legislating begins, especially if the legislation in question solves a problem that has already been contoured and clarified and defined through the oversight process. And I also include this data because GAO itself specifically mentions that many of its high-risk items cannot be fully solved without legislation. And so ultimately, I argue that is one of the primary goals of oversight, is bureaucratic problem solving. And so I look at that in a couple ways. First, through traditional oversight hearings, and second, through legislative provisions designed to address high-risk issues identified by GAO. And I rely on three sets of models to test the effect of divided government. That's my goal, testing the effect of divided government on high-risk oversight and more broadly bureaucratic problem solving. So my first DV of interest is just a raw count of the number of legislative provisions enacted per year and per policy area. And I use a negative binomial regression model there with policy area fixed effects. And I include a couple of controls. First, I control for the number of high-risk items on the list. in a particular Congress. The reason obviously is that a longer list would predict more legislative solutions. And then I also control for the first 2 years of a new presidential term, per Mayhew's argument that these are the most legislatively productive years. And for the two sets of models assessing oversight hearings, I have 2 DVs of interest. The first dependent variable is the likelihood of a committee's addressing a high-risk issue over time. So I use separate logistic regression models for each chamber, House and Senate. And I include a few controls. First, length of the high-risk list, which I've already explained. Second, I control for presidential approval, and this is based on Kreiner and Schickler's work that that presidential approval provides an incentive for oversight. I control for the size of the committee. I just measure that as the number of subcommittees on a particular standing committee. And finally, I include some time dummies by presidential administration with 1990 to 1992 as the baseline category. And I also include a third set of models of interest, and that's my second dependent variable that measures the hazard ratio of the amount of time between a high-risk report's release and a high-risk hearing. So this is essentially a measure of the risk or the probability that a committee will address a high-risk issue over the 24 months in a congressional session. So I use separate Cox proportional hazards regression models for the House and Senate, and I include the same controls as in the logistic models. And what I find, first of all, is that divided government does predict more legislative solutions to high-risk issues. And these results are significant at the 0.01 level. And I should mention, that these findings should be considered in tandem with the overall consensus in the literature that divided government tends to produce fewer significant or landmark pieces of legislation, whereas my models predict that divided government actually produces more legislative solutions to high-risk issues, again, identified by GAO. In the sets of models focused on committee hearings, the results are quite different by chamber. So under divided government, the House is significantly more likely to hold hearings on high-risk issues. And this is true both in the logistic models, significant, very highly significant at the 0.001 level. And it's also true in the proportional hazards models, also highly significant. But both models produce null effects in the Senate. And so overall, we can say that standing committees in the House tend to prioritize high-risk oversight. There's a greater probability of high-risk oversight under divided government than under united, although partisanship does not appear to have any effect on high-risk oversight in the Senate. So I want to go through these results just a little bit more in depth and kind of speculate about why we might see the results that we do. First, my first finding that more legislative solutions to high-risk issues occur under divided government versus united. These legislative provisions, they're not at all trivial, right, substantively, but they may be considered less controversial or less salient. And that might explain why divided government presents an opportunity to legislate on high-risk issues, as opposed to broader policy reforms that tend to stall under these kinds of partisan conditions. And there is some evidence in the literature that divided government indeed spurs legislation on less salient issues. So that's worth mentioning as well. Turning to the results on the two models that measure effects of divided government on oversight hearings, again, much more traditional measure of oversight. Why do we see these results? Why might we see a higher probability of high-risk hearings under divided government in the House, but not in the Senate? Obviously, historically, the House is the more partisan chamber, and House hearings can be convened with little to no minority party buy-in, whereas Senate hearing agendas generally require much more bipartisan majority-minority cooperation. So that's the first thing. Second is my results suggest that House members may indeed use high-risk hearings as vehicles for partisan position taking. And I'll go back to the tables here, the significance in both models of the presidential approval covariate really supports this conclusion that high-risk hearings may be used as a vehicle for partisan position taking. But this is a positive outcome, a normatively positive outcome, regardless of intent, right? Under divided government, House committees might actually conduct more high quality oversight rooted in the judgments of the accountability community. And so regardless of intent here, this is an outcome that I argue we should celebrate and might be a silver lining to partisanship in Congress. And just to briefly wrap up here, I want to say a few words about questions that my project poses for further study. First is the question about whether again, this silver lining of partisanship, would partisanship be able to promote good oversight under certain conditions and more efficient bureaucratic problem solving? And then second, and a bit more broadly, is should oversight be considered as a pluralistic process, much like legislating? Right? I think it's really worth considering whether different types of oversight might respond to different incentives. And scholars should examine these different types of oversight, whether it's high-risk problems in the administrative state, whether it's high-profile investigations of the president, whether it's issue-based inquiries, with distinct lenses as a result. So I will stop there, and I look forward to all of your questions, and Jen, to hearing your comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. And last but not least, we have Kenny's presentation. And I'd like to say that Kenny's fellowship was generously sponsored in part by the Sunwater Institute. So I'll let Kenny take over from here.
Okay, thank you. We're running a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to go quickly through this. Nicely, Claire's presentation actually sets up a lot of some of the things that I was going to say. This is a project that tries to measure or to quantify two dimensions of legislative oversight and figure out what those dimensions of oversight can tell us about oversight in Congress in general. So we do this systematically for a sample of hearings. So what I want to do in this presentation is tell you why we do that and how we do that. I'm going to first tell you who the we is. It's not just myself, it's my colleague Christian Fong, two undergraduate students, Aisha Sujin, and then two graduate students, Adam Rao and Logan Woods. And as Jen mentioned, this is funded not only by the Sunwater Institute and Levin Center, we also secured funding from our college and from the Center for Effective Lawmaking at Vanderbilt and the University of Virginia. Our guiding research question is what determines the quality of legislative oversight. The main context here is something that Claire alluded to, which is that if you asked people about Congress's capacity, institutional capacity today, they would tell you a lot of kind of negative things, that capacity for oversight and legislating in general is on the decline. The staff are young, the members' incentives for messaging are more powerful than they ever have been. Members stay on committees less time than they used to, right? This isn't the golden era where committee chairs were very powerful. People tend to rotate off and specialize less. And this has all impacted oversights, right? So you'll hear some of the quotes that Claire mentioned. People have the general sense that the opposition party hates oversight, the majority party loves it, and they use it as a political tool. It's just an opportunity for them to grandstand rather than facilitate accountability. Now, if you look at the political science research on this topic in particular, they will mostly confirm a generalized, stylized fact that there are political patterns in oversight. That is, Congress investigates more and they investigate more intensely during divided government, right? That is a pattern that's exhibited across all kinds of things, legislative hearings, the presence or absence of witnesses. And this is something that has been confirmed for across about a dozen studies over the last 20 years or so. But again, as Claire alluded to, the frequency of oversight doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the quality of that oversight, which you could argue that we need to know something about the quality of that oversight in order to answer some of the more normative questions about whether this oversight is effective or important, or whether the quality is going down during those periods, right? So is partisanship damaging oversight, or could it actually be facilitating it, right? You need to know something about the oversight itself to answer that question. So the way we approach that is quite different than the way that Claire approached it. We conceptualize oversight on two dimensions. One dimension, which you would call neutral, or something that benefits everybody, non-zero sum, and then another dimension that is zero sum. The neutral dimension is what we refer to as information revealing. This is the idealized form of oversight that, among others, the Levin Center tries to teach, which is we want fact-based information put onto the public record that is useful not only for the legislator who's introducing it, but also for their other legislators and all kinds of other folks, right? So this is what might be called in the political science literature a kind of valence dimension of oversight. The zero-sum dimension is something we refer to as confrontation. This is the oversight that you'll be very familiar with when a legislator gets very upset with a witness and says you're doing a very poor job, and in general tries to sort of punish the witness in public for doing a very poor job. The most fundamental thing that we think they're doing is presenting a contrast between themselves, the competent one who's serving the constituent, and the incompetent bureaucrat or the member of the president's party, the appointee who's not doing a very good job. Right, so this is our zero-sum dimension. This is the common ideological dimension that political scientists are so interested in. Now, importantly, we think these are separable dimensions. These are different things, and you need to understand both of them at the same time in order to understand whether or not partisanship is actually damaging oversight. Okay, so what we do is we take a small sample of hearings. Usually the thing to do is do like what Devin did and collect the largest sample you could possibly imagine over the longest period of time you could. And that's what most research has done over the last couple of decades, collected mostly oversight hearings. What we're instead going to look at is a smaller set of oversight hearings within HISGAC and the House Oversight Committee across the 110th and 111th Congress. And instead of looking at the oversight hearings individually, our unit of analysis is going to be the most discretionary interaction that we can imagine between a member and the witness, which is they have these question periods. They're usually a 5-minute period. And within that period, I, as a member, have kind of complete discretion over how I behave. I can be more or less informational and more or less confrontational. To get into our sample, these hearings and these question periods had to have at least one government witnesses. So this is dyadic relationships between the legislature and the executive branch. This is not sort of outside experts or like, someone who was damaged by the policy or something like that. Okay. Then what we do is our generalized approach is we are going to we created a survey interface which feeds these question periods into a user interface where I get two randomly, not entirely randomly, two mostly random selection of question periods. And then I simply compare them. I say one is more informational than the other, and this other one is more confrontational than the other. And then the idea is I get a lot of those comparisons from as many people as possible. And then we aggregate them together with a Bayesian model that gives or spits out scores for both an informational dimension and a confrontational dimension. Okay. Now, the most distinguishing feature of our approach here is we are not going to sort of crowdsource this by paying people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk or something like that. What we tried to do is we tried to go to the oversight experts themselves. This is current and former congressional staff. And this is where the Levin Center really stepped in for us and referred us to many of these individuals who agreed to do this, some of them free of charge, most of them were paid in honorarium. This took a couple of hours for each one of them. So this was an intense process. You have to sit there and be patient. It takes a while to learn and to be efficient at it. In tandem with that, we also paid undergraduates and some research assistants to do this so that we would have a relative comparison sample to see what we were gaining by looking or by paying individuals in order to do this. Okay. The other sort of innovative feature of our approach, which I'm not going to talk too much about, is to make this tractable, given how difficult it is to recruit congressional staff. We had to set up our pairwise comparisons such that they were not random. So what we did was we pre-selected a set of what we would call 9 bridges. These are 9 question periods, which we have looked at, and we have determined these are likely to be high, medium, low on information and confrontation. And then we can, in order to add something to the data set, we have to have at least one person rate that new text in relation to those other 9. So those 9 bridging texts would be depicted in the middle in the blue, and then to add one like an I or a C in the red, we have to compare it to those additional 9 in order to actually complete the network so that we can get these scores. Okay, so on to results. So the first and most important thing, this is a sample of some of the question periods that we have. Democrats are in red, Republicans are in blue. The first and most important thing is these are, in fact, separable dimensions, we think. If they weren't separable, you would see a really high correlation between them. There would just be a line across going this way or that way, depending upon if they were negatively or positively correlated. But they do, in fact, appear to be quite different. Something can be very highly informational and very highly confrontational, or it could be the opposite. It could be highly informational and not confrontational at all, right? So there's something, or there are examples of everything in each one of those sort of basic quadrants. Now it's a more complicated or important questions, which is, does that information, the information and confrontation change depending upon political context, right? So if my partisanship or my party relationship with the sitting president changes, do we see the nature of the individual's oversight changing, okay, subsequently? So what we did was we set up an analysis where we have our dependent variables, which are those features of congressional oversight, and then we have member of the president's party as the main independent variable. Now remember, I'm showing you congressional hearings from the 110th to 111th Congress. That's the Bush to Obama transition, right? So the effect here is going to be identified by I as a Republican getting an Obama, or getting Obama as the president, and now suddenly going to become the opposition party. And so we're going to look within legislator, okay? And what we find is that members, as you would expect, when I become a member of the president's party, all of a sudden my oversight tends to get less confrontational. I get less angry at witnesses. I don't highlight negative or particularly damning facts. I don't make them repeat things that make them look bad. But importantly, their ratings are not, or their oversight is not less informational. So they're still introducing the same amount of information, or there's, at least it's not statistically distinguishable for us, but it's the way that they're presenting the information is systematically less favorable. Okay. Okay. And those are the coefficients for that. I'm going to skip this just because of time. Okay, another important finding that we gleaned from this is that sort of in keeping with the last, that's sort of related to the last results, you might wonder whether information or confrontation are substitutes or complements, or maybe they're completely unrelated at all. What we found in general is that they seem to be complements, right? Meaning they're positively correlated. If someone gets more confrontational, that's not that they get less informational, they actually tend to get slightly more informational. But there's a caveat here, which is interesting and a point that I'd love to talk more about in the Q&A if there's time, is that to actually see that, you have to get an expert, okay? So if you look left to right, we have our experts who are congressional staff, and then we have research assistants who have worked with us, know what we're doing, and we've trained them. And then on the other side, we have students in a class who are just doing this as quickly as they can, right? So you could think of that as the closest thing to sort of crowdsourcing this judgment. And what you find is that the farther you get away from that expertise, the less they seem to be able to pick up the informational component of the hearings, right? You actually have to have a certain amount of expertise to pick up that dimension of policy. Otherwise, you just default to, oh, this looks bad or this looks good. But if you rely on the experts, and there are other reasons I can go into, which you probably should, these dimensions of oversight tend to be slightly positively correlated. It's not huge, right? So they are different dimensions, but it is a positive complementary relationship. And then lastly, the most interesting and I think exciting finding that we had was we looked at the presence of individuals or participation of individuals, members in hearings as a function of the dimensions that I just introduced to you, okay? And in general, what we found is that as you increase the amount of confrontation in the members' oversight, you tend to increase the participation in hearings. So what does that tell us? It seems to be the case that more sort of fiery or confrontational hearings tend to incentivize members to actually show up. And it sort of makes sense, right? If you go through and you read these, actually read these hearings, the ones that are sort of the most low key and just sort of either presenting information or really it's not. So information doesn't increase or decrease participation, but the ones that are less confrontational, that involve less energy, that it makes sense why someone would not actually show up. So our main takeaways, at least from the study, which we try to pitch, is that yes, we can confirm a kind of classic finding that members are partisanship, and really more importantly, your relationship or orientation toward the executive branch is going to change your oversight behavior. But a perhaps slightly better story is that that doesn't necessarily mean that the oversight itself is lower quality if you define quality as introducing the kind of information that we're interested in. And furthermore, it might be the case that that confrontational dimension of oversight actually incentivizes members to participate, right? So if you had in your mind that, right, the most idealized form of oversight was just nothing but information, well, it might be the case that members would have less incentive to attend that oversight, and they may not be exposed to that information the same way they would be if it was a hearing that they were incentivized to. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close because we're over presentation time, but I really look forward to our conversation, and thank the Levin Center again for support for this research. So thank you.
Thanks, Kenny. So as I told the panelists, I'm going to send them each my more traditional discussant comments in person so that we have time to have a more fruitful discussion than a point by point. I have questions about this model type thing. But I did want to highlight some common themes that I thought about as I was reading each of these papers, because I think it'll structure our conversation nicely. One of the traditional theoretical stories in political science and in the literature is that oversight doesn't get rewarded. Legislating is hard, so that casework sort of provides the best opportunity for position taking, credit claiming, and advertising. And what I think in various ways these three papers do is raise questions about that. Like, is that true? It seems to me that at a minimum, the lines across these things are not as clear as theoretically foundational literature tends to suggest. So for example, Devin's work prompts us to think about the overlap between constituency service and policy. Kenny's work highlights the tension really between credit claiming and information gathering. And Claire's work raises questions about who drives the oversight agenda. And if government exists in part to solve important dilemmas in society and to enhance the lives of citizens, then we need to ask the question, who decides what a dilemma is, what dilemmas are worth government action? Is it citizens? Is it government themselves? And how do governmental officials act to build consensus on how to proceed addressing these important dilemmas once they have decided to act? And at the heart of all of the fellows' research questions is, when is the actual agenda formed? That's sort of what made me think about. I was thinking about one of my favorite paragraphs from Fiorina's Congress, the Keystone of Washington Establishment, which I actually have memorized because I love it so much. But it says that members of Congress earn electoral credits by establishing various programs. And then legislation is drafted in general terms so that some agency existing or newly established must translate vague policy mandates into functioning programs. And this is a process that necessitates the promulgation of numerous rules and regulations, and incidentally, the trampling of multiple toes. And then at the next stage, aggrieved and or hopeful constituents petition their member of Congress to intervene in this really complex or at least obscure decision-making that goes on in the executive branch and in the bureaucracy. And then the cycle closes when the legislator lends a sympathetic ear, piously denounces the evils of the bureaucracy, and intervenes in the latter's decision-making process, thus riding a grateful electorate to an even more impressive electoral showing. And if that's true, then I think we need to think a little bit more carefully about the initial decision to delegate and to whom, because that inevitably affects the opportunities for oversight. And so as I was reading all of the papers, in part because of my own research bias, I wanted to know a little bit more about the executive agencies that were the target of these things and what patterns there were with respect to that. And of course, that sort of thing is, I recognize, beyond the parameters of each of your individual research questions for the most part, but my mind couldn't help but go there. And it also suggests that, going back to my original point, we really do need to define our concepts better as political scientists. So the projects that we just heard about all raise the question, where does oversight begin and end? Not to mention, what is oversight and what are the different facets of oversight? And as political scientists in particular, I really don't think we've done a good job about delineating where those marks are, or really thinking carefully about where oversight begins and ends, what is included in that conceptual bucket called oversight, and what are the different facets of that. Oversight is not just hearings. And as all three papers suggest we need to do a better job of thinking about like the everyday as well as high profile investigations. And I also wondered, and this is like a current hobby horse of mine, when we're thinking of conceptual definitions, what do we do with oversight of private industry? Because in political science, we tend to think of oversight as oversight of the executive branch. But honestly, Kenny's last part of his presentation, when he talked about the fact that congressional staff tend to view the world a little bit differently than the rest of us, because they're the ones who are actually doing this stuff. If you were to talk to a congressional staffer, most of them would say that oversight involves oversight of private industry as well. And we don't have a good grasp on that as political scientists. And so I have two additional points I want to make, also common themes throughout them all. This idea of quantity versus quality, personal and contextual versus systemic patterns as empiricists. And I put myself in this category with all of the weaknesses that involves. We tend to condense things into numbers. And as institutionalists, we tend to think about how a set of rules that prescribe processes for reaching and enforcing collective agreements affect individual action. But as one of my mentors, Bruce Oppenheimer, once told me, we are all behavioralists. We are all trying to understand why and how legislators behave. And this is a super meta question. But if people are people with different ways of doing the same job, then does categorization of their actions in the way that we typically do in empirical political science actually really matter? Would it be better for us to focus our time a little bit more on the personal nature of politics? Which brings me to my last point, the differences between the House and the Senate, which came out actually also in all of your papers, which is another influence from ops. Oddly, this is the one area of congressional studies where we do tend to recognize context. We often attribute differential patterns in the House and the Senate to differences in culture norms or differences in constituencies and electoral pressures that are on the two chambers. But there are also really important differences in rules. So in institutional rules. So for example, the laws and rules regarding staffing allocations differ across the two chambers in really meaningful ways. And in addition to the varying skills of various committees across and within chambers, it's really important to recognize that there's a variation in the availability of enforcement mechanisms across the two chambers, and honestly within different policy contexts. So not only does the law create differential legal standards for the House and the Senate's information requests, but there are also different standards depending upon policy area. And thinking a little bit more carefully about all of that would really help us inform the scholarship, not just our scholarship, myself included, but political sciences scholarship moving forward. And so with that, I am going to open it up to question and answer, because I would love for our faithful audience to be able to interact with the fellows. And our first question is actually for Devin. Does this project look at references to oversight actors and institutions like agency IGs or GAO? You alluded to the networked quality of some oversight issues, linking Congress, interest groups, and agencies, that sort of thing. Oversight actors like IG and GAO too, right?
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So I've thus far been studying how legislators align with and cite like companies or interest group kind of campaigns. You can frequently kind of connect the dots there, which I think you recognize. It is on my near-term agenda to look at citations to hearings and reports, which I referenced a few of those in those like qualitative examples. And I think citations to GAO and IG reports fits really well with that like sort of next stage of the project, and will be really easy to build in. So that's a great idea, and I appreciate it. I don't have any, I guess I'll conclude that I don't have any findings there. It's just about how, but I expect to find a lot, right? Because there's a lot of citations to various types of evidence, and those are in this context like powerful, normatively powerful, like factual documents.
And we, again, feel free to drop any questions into the chat, because I have a ton, but I get to interact with the fellows on a fairly regular basis. But I will also give the fellows an opportunity to respond to each other if you have questions for one another. If not, I can plow forward with my own questions. So one thing that I was wondering about is the difference between individual member behavior and committee behavior. So each of you at times conflate the two. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about either why that wouldn't be an issue or whether it would be. Yeah, Claire.
Yeah, I'll address that. I think that's a really good point and something I actually struggled with. And I found myself in my paper changing member to committee quite a lot just to kind of avoid that kind of conceptual distinction. I think in the House, it presents less of a problem simply because the committee chair, I think, arguably has more power there, and individual members have a lot less power. They kind of just show up, they ask their questions and then leave. Occasionally, they'll make requests to the chair, like, oh, I'd love to have a hearing on this, but ultimately, I think that's still pretty rare. I think it's a much bigger issue in the Senate, and there, I haven't really quite been able to figure out a way of distinguishing between, what members want versus what the committee wants, and that's something I'm continuing to think about a lot, especially when it comes to the Senate.
Yeah, that is a good point, and we actually evolved a bit of our unit of analysis in a way that I think is meaningful to answer that question. So starting and thinking about what a member does, and then realizing that so much of the work of a member's office is done by the staff, that you kind of have to think about the member's office as an organization with staff that empower and drive and are sort of really meaningful in shaping what attention, right? What things get attention in the first place, and then what institutional processes there are for realizing the members' own goals. And so to take then that to the committee context and say staff are extremely important in a member's office, committee staff are important, and then the extent to which we can adopt a member as an organization model of individual letters that the member's office is sending, and then asking, well, what about the letters that the committee chair is sending? Is that a similar type of decision-making process, relying on similar, the expertise and how long the committee staff have been in that office engaging with that agency, or how long they've been with that member, helping that member translate their goals maybe on that committee into things. I'm not sure how parallel those two types of organizational forms are. We've kind of been treating them the same as you said, but I'd be really interested in trying to tease out the differences between the organizational form of a member's office and the organizational form of a committee, and the results that then has for, output of how the member is engaging in policymaking, oversight, et cetera.
Well, and I think on that last point, one of the, it's interesting in its own right to just on itself. But if we're thinking about the way that agencies respond to oversight, then it actually does matter. Like thinking more, it would be interesting to know if I'm an agency, do I perceive, and we know from Kenny's work in particular and others that there are responses, like agencies respond differently to different types of requests, but connecting that to the larger organization, I think would be interesting. Again, just thinking from the executive branch's perspective.
Jen, on the committee question. So this is something we thought about. We're looking at we're always looking at the question or oversight behavior of individual members. But one of the things that we know is that majority staff often write lists of questions and then assign them to members to ask. That's not something we can observe. But I still think that they may have a template that gets put in front of them, but the way they ask those questions is still an expression of their own behavior, and the ones they choose to say and not say is still meaningful. I sure wish we could sort of see what that shadow template was and what they were being fed and what the sort of distance between that and what they actually do was. But yeah, it's an interesting question and something we're always trying to grapple with.
And then we have a comment in the chat that talks about oversight of the laws within each committee's jurisdiction would include alleged private sector wrongdoing, which falls within these laws that we're talking about. And so again, that's getting back to this idea of private industry, connecting private industry to delegation laws, and then ultimately agencies that are enforcing the rules that govern private industry. And we have a question for Claire that is about the GAO high risk list, is that it's a relatively recent institutional innovation, as you note in your paper, but didn't get a chance to say in the presentation. And anecdotally, at least, recognition and salience of high risk lists among members in news media has changed over time. So could you talk a little bit more about the temporal dimensions in your analysis?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a really great one, and something I really struggled with. Like, I only have data. We can only go back to 1990. That's still very recent, and especially it's well into the kind of hyper partisanship of the contemporary Congress, or really just at the beginning of it, if we consider the early 90s to be the beginning. And so I really did think through a lot of different ways to address the time dimension here. I think the time dummies I included were really just a first stab. I think that something that has changed is I think that Congress itself over time has started to put a little bit more of a, or has had started to put a little bit more of a priority on, but also there's kind of been a broader recognition of the high risk list over time. And in 2009, the House changed its rules to mandate that every committee hold at least 3 hearings on high risk issues. I believe I may be getting that wrong, but there was sort of a minimum standard of the number of high risk issues that that committees had to address. And so I think that does point to an increased awareness of the importance of the list and a kind of recognition. Certainly members both sides of the aisle that this is an important kind of metric of the most pressing bureaucratic problems. So I think there has been a broader recognition of the list's importance, but there unfortunately my study is limited just by the fact that the list was innovated relatively recently, and something I'm also going to continue doing as this project develops is I'm going to also look at the list of management challenges from the inspector generals of the big government agencies. And that also suffers from recency bias, because I think those management challenges just began in the late 90s, that they started to be pretty reliably reported. But that is something that, at least if I can't expand my data set temporally, at least I can kind of, I can expand the lens a little bit and look at what other members of the accountability community consider to be the most pressing issues.
Thank you. And I'm going to give a last call for burning questions that you may have. And you can always feel free to, yes, Devin has a burning question.
Well, right. So I just want to hear a little bit more from Kenny on this, this interesting concept of the boring committee hearings. So in the paper, you talk about how the ones that are low on both confrontation and information focus on things like opinions, personal anecdotes, interpretations of quotes. And I'm used to thinking of text as a mix of things. And I'm wondering if it's just sort of a catch-all category in that third group, or if there are some other dimensions that might be emerging that are not related to the contrast drawing or the information, but rather related to some other, making some other political statement or whatever. I just found that a fascinating potential, more that I wanted to know, I guess.
Yeah, so I should say the things that are both low information and low confrontation tend to be members using their 5 minutes, not to ask any questions, but to just say things like, I think this is a really great hearing, and my position on this issue is X. Right. So, one thing we don't distinguish between in this is information that is requested versus information that's put out there on the record. So that could be one dimension of this that we're not capturing. And the things that tend to be low information, low confrontation, and the things that tend to be low confrontation in general, like the member tends to do a lot more of the talking. Right. So they're not being particularly curious in the hearing. And, you could, of course, the other bias here is that there's a lot of members who probably could have participated and just don't. Right. So that tells us, I think this relationship with the relationships that I showed you, the partisanship thing, the complementarity thing, if we somehow manage to bring in the folks who just are non-participants, you'd see those patterns emerge a lot more starkly, I think.
Okay, well, I am going to thank all of our panelists and our audience for attending. I would also like to give a plug for anyone who is interested in applying for the fellowship for our next round. We would love to be able to consider you. And if you have a wonderful, really exciting working or recently published paper that you would like to nominate, and we always take self-nominations, we encourage you to submit that for our Excellent in Oversight Research Award that we'll be putting out a call for that later on in the coming month or so. But we encourage you to submit as anything that you think you would like us to consider. So thank you very much for all of your hard work, fellows. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Jen.
Thanks, everyone.